Welcome to Red, White, and Blue. From the right, I'm Gary Polland.
And from the left, I'm David Jones. Our guest tonight is Ronnie Earle. He has filed for the position of Lieutenant Governor in the Democratic primary. Mr. Earle was once a municipal court judge in Austin, Texas, representing that county in part in the state legislature in the 70s, and for 31 years was the district attorney of Travis County. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
The only thing I left out was that you once worked for John B. Conley.
I did, in fact.
Yes, you've got quite a history here in the state of Texas, but now that you're running against Gary's friend David Dewhurst, you've got some explaining to do, right, Gary?
Well, it's politics, so we're going to talk about that. Well, first of all, you're in a primary race. You have an opponent in the Democratic primary.
Actually, I have two opponents.
You have two opponents.
Yes.
Okay, well, that shows you what I know about the Democrats.
I don't like to talk about them much,
yes.
But I think I do have two opponents.
And generally speaking, it's fair to say that the pundits think you're the favorite to win the nomination.
Well, I like to think so, but I don't tell myself that very often. I prefer to run hungry, as they say.
And that's why you came to spend a half hour with two scintillating personalities like David and I.
Oh, actually, I was just your names are household words throughout the state, and I just wanted to share.
Okay, well, let's talk about the politics of the race, not in the primary, but let's talk about the general election. David Dewhurst is the incumbent lieutenant governor, is worth $100 million, can write a personal check to fund his campaign and everyone else's campaign if he wanted to. He's running for re-election, and you're challenging him. How do you become, this would be the first Democrat to win a statewide race in a number of years?
Well, I think people are really tired of the way things operate in Austin. There's a lot of insider dealing, and only a few people get their needs attended to, and there are people who don't have many needs that they can't satisfy with a great deal of money. And I think the public is ready for its own candidate to occupy statewide office. And I think the lieutenant governor's office is uniquely situated to meet the needs of Texans.
Which of the recent lieutenant governors would you model yourself on if you were elected lieutenant governor?
Well, that's a great question. Bob Bullock and I became friends after a while. My office investigated him the grand juries investigated him a couple of times, and he thought I was behind that. I wasn't, but he thought I was. And so we had something of a fight lasted a couple of years, and then a grand jury finally heard the case and decided not to indict him, and then we became friends after that.
So that's your model.
Bullock, not that part of it. No, not that part. But Bullock did a great job of marshaling the forces and shepherding good legislation through the legislature as lieutenant governor, as presiding officer of the Senate. And I have a great deal of admiration for him. I have a lot of admiration for Bill Hobby, who served in that position for a number of years and was a gracious and absolutely totally effective lieutenant governor.
And some would say that those days are gone. You know, it is now a partisan dogfight, just as it is in Washington, right in Austin. And you probably know as much about that as anyone, given your history with the investigation of Tom DeLay. So, to Gary's point, running against David Dewhurst with his millions of dollars, you have to counter that as a member of a ticket, I would guess. And what do you make of the Democrats as a ticket in November?
I don't know that people of Texas like tickets very much. They don't like to have their options narrowly limited that way. I think the people of Texas like to look at the individual person's qualifications, where they're coming from, what they say, what they stand for, where they've been in their lives. And I'm absolutely ready for that contest.
Well, that means you will compete with David Dewhurst at the money level, it seems, rather than taking the ticket approach, which is your choice. How do you get a message out where you're bragging about the following things? That crime dropped three times faster in Travis County than it did anywhere else while you were DA. That you sponsored the first victim assistance program, the first public integrity unit, and established some community justice council. Those don't sound like the type of issues that attract lots of contributors.
Well, I think a couple of things. They may not attract lots of contributors, but they certainly attract lots of citizens and lots of voters. It's been my experience traveling around the state that people really like to hear how we lowered the crime rate in Austin and how ordinary citizens took part in that effort. We opened the doors of the courthouse so that it was not simply the province of lawyers and prosecutors and police officers and judges and people who work there, but the public came in. And that's what I propose to do as Lieutenant Governor. We have a great deal of potential in the citizenry of Texas that is not being adequately taken advantage of because of the influence of the lobby. The lobby considers itself the third house of government. Excuse me. And the result of that is that most of the decisions that are made by the legislature are heavily influenced by the lobby. I didn't like that when I was there. I was there in the immediate aftermath of Sharpstown. That's when I served in the House of Representatives, and I'll tell you, people were really good then. Sharpstown had a way of getting everybody's attention. And people were good. They just were I won't say they were good, but they were different then, a different kind of bad maybe.
The spotlight was on their conduct, obviously.
Absolutely. And I think also the public was more aware of what was going on in Austin than the public has been lately. It's kind of, we have gotten into the place where we like to delegate the functions of government to people who are like professionals. And some members of the legislature have been there for a very long time, and they kind of become like professionals. And that is not the way democracy is supposed to work. It's okay for people to be there a long time, but they need to be watched, and they need to have some interaction with the people they work for. That's democracy. And so that's what I hope to bring to the Lieutenant Governor's office.
Now, if you look at, and we're still talking about the politics of it, Democrat versus Republican, if you look at the message of the Scott Brown victory in the Massachusetts Senate race, a historic win for Republicans in a very Democratic state, how do you read that as something that is going to impact on your race, and is it positive or negative?
I think it's very positive. I think people are tired of insider deals. They're tired of the inside players running the state. In a democracy, the people are supposed to run the government, supposed to run the state. And I think people are really tired of the same players being heavily influential over matters that affect ordinary Texans. And I think they're ready for a changing of the guard. And I don't think people pay much attention to Democratic and Republican labels. I think they look at the person. And I think that's an ancient tradition in Texas. You judge a person by how much work they can do in a day, not by how they vote come election day.
Well, Gary would probably tell you that the leading insider in the Republican primary is Rick Perry. And certainly Kay Bailey Hutchison is attacking him as being a wheeler dealer and sort of corrupt in her own nice way. She's saying that.
Well, cronyism.
Cronyism, exactly. So I guess the question is, wouldn't it be better for Ronnie Earle to have once put one of those big shots that you went after, whether it was Kay Bailey Hutchison, Jim Maddox, who was Attorney General, Tom DeLay, the congressman that was indicted during your last term, had gone to jail? Wouldn't that have helped?
Well,
no, in terms of straightening out things.
You will pardon me for not wanting to comment on the most recent case, the DeLay case. It is still bouncing around the appellate court structure. And one thing that I don't need is an allegation of unethical conduct. And so I don't want to comment on that particular case.
I'm just saying that generally, wouldn't people be behaving better in our political world? And now we have Rick Perry, who you say is the ultimate big shot crony, as is Kay Bailey Hutchison saying that. He's winning.
Well, as Benjamin Franklin said, the prospect of being shot at dawn has a remarkable facility for focusing the attention. And the same thing is true about prosecution. The threat of prosecution is very, very effective at controlling unethical conduct. But there's a difference between what's unethical and what's illegal. And there's one may be as bad as the other. But people are careful about crossing the line of illegality. But unethical conduct is a whole different deal. That is what that's a job for the public to enforce, because that has to do with public standards of decency and what people expect. And people expect a lot higher standards of decency from their neighbors than they do from their member of the legislature in Austin.
Interesting. Let's talk about some of the problems you might be dealing with if you're elected Lieutenant Governor in November. Budget shortfall. Estimates are from anywhere from 12, maybe upward to $20 billion that we will be short in this next budget for the biennium because of the reduction in tax revenue coming in the state and the ongoing slow economy, not just in Texas but around the country. How do we close that gap, either by taxes or spending cuts? Thoughts?
Well, I have a number of thoughts about that, and I'll begin with the idea that immediately jumps out at anybody who studies this issue very much, and that is that the Texas tax structure is a polyglot arrangement of taxes of various kinds. There's a sales tax, there's an excise tax, there's this tax and that tax, and most of those taxes fall most heavily on the middle class. And the reason for that is because the middle class is vastly underrepresented in the lobby in Austin. You can tell how successful a lobbyist is by the level of taxation whatever industry hired him or her to represent them in Austin has to pay. I think the very first thing that has to do is the whole tax structure of Texas needs to be re-examined. Man, we could get past a large part of this shortfall by use of the so-called rainy day fund. And that's a fallback position that is always available. But I have always wanted to see some kind of look, some kind of an investigation, some kind of study in a bipartisan way of the whole Texas tax structure. We might want to come up with something totally different that would be more fair, because the present tax structure, taxes fall most heavily on the middle class. And as you know, a disaffected middle class is the first requirement of a total economic breakdown. And our middle class is shrinking, the lower classes are getting bigger, and very few people at the top, just a very, very few, are getting richer and richer.
More than likely, you would agree with the people of Oregon, then, who supported a referendum recently that raised taxes on the top 1% of those voters in order to balance their budget. Just the wealthy, top 1%. Now, is that, you recommend that to the state of Texas? And are the wealthy of the state getting too large a break in terms of their funding of all of our services?
The greatest victimized group in our current structure is the middle class. It's what's shrinking, and that is really dangerous to the future of democracy. The higher income levels, everything would be on the table in the study that I'm talking about. Higher taxes for the wealthy, that's on the table. It's all on the table. Everybody, and this needs to be debated and talked about, and it needs to be talked about by the public, not just by the members of the legislature. Those large moneyed interests often fund political campaigns. And so people who get elected are going to be naturally more protective of that level of society. But for that reason, I would like to see a study that would consist of people from all levels, not just members of the legislature, but a task force that would consist of ordinary citizens as well as some members of the legislature to study the entire apparatus by which we fund government, because government is just another word for all of us acting together. And if it doesn't represent all of us, then it's not a democracy.
Well, it wasn't a democracy in 2002, according to what I've read about your investigation of the 8 corporations that were indicted and 2 or 3 other people, one of whom was close to Mr. DeLay, another one was close to Karl Rove. And you basically said that corporate power had stolen the election of 2002 and installed Republicrats in order to re-engineer state government entirely for the benefit, you would say, of certain corporate interests who had their business in the legislature that followed that election of 2002.
Yes, and I absolutely...
you believe that?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. They made no bones about it. They collected a bunch of money from corporations in violation of Texas law. We prosecuted. We investigated and prosecuted. It was against the law. It is against the law for corporations to donate money to political campaigns. Now, the most recent Supreme Court decision is going to throw that into some kind of question, although I still think the Texas law is still enforceable. That is a huge step. I mean, there was a time when corporations absolutely controlled every legislative body in the United States. Corporations are not people. They do not breathe. They do not eat. They do not have to sleep. But according to the Supreme Court, they have many of the attributes of a human being. Now, that is absurd. And I won't,
so you would not
I
be
won't
in favor
bother
of
you. I won't bother you with my table pounding.
Yeah, so you would not
feelings
favor
about that.
Texas liberalizing its laws on corporate political donations to fall in line with the Supreme Court decision?
Absolutely not. I think as soon as corporations become endowed with human characteristics by nature or by God, then I'd be in favor of it. But until then, which I doubt if that ever happens. I'm opposed to that.
If you are elected, you will probably have to deal with a Republican majority in the state Senate, based on number of races up this year and the like, at least for 2 years. How would you deal with the majority being in the other party?
Same way I've dealt with issues throughout my career. I have a reputation, I have a reputation for fair dealing and for treating people as ends in themselves, as opposed to means to somebody else's ends. The numbers on my tenure as district attorney, we prosecuted something like 17 elected officials. 12 of them were Democrats and 5 of them were Republicans, or maybe it was 3 or 4 Republicans. There were very few Republicans prosecuted, and the reason that we prosecuted more Democrats...
Because we're more dishonest than Republicans, right?
Well, some people would say that, but for most of my tenure, the Democrats held the power, and the law penalizes and criminalizes abuses of power. And so, as a result, we prosecuted more Democrats than Republicans. The only people who are madder at me than the Republicans are the Democrats, because we prosecuted more Democrats than Republicans.
So you would you see, as Lieutenant Governor, you would run a bipartisan body, you'd have Republican chairman, you'd have Democratic chairman, you'd spread them around the different committees so there'd be a representation of both parties and regions and the like?
I think that the thing that I bring to this race and I would bring to that office is that I understand how to be fair. I spent 3.5 years as a municipal judge, as the best job I ever had. I do know something about being fair, and I have been on the other end of that too. I know what unfairness feels like.
Let's talk about fairness, because you were a prosecutor and you know something about this state's history as far as locking up people who are innocent, executing even some, as far as we know. Mm-hmm. What would Ronnie Earle do as Lieutenant Governor to change the administration of criminal justice so that we don't have people sitting there for 20 years who are innocent?
Well,
what reforms can we expect?
We lowered the crime rate in Austin significantly. We lowered the murder rate. In 1991, there were 49 murders in Austin. And in 2008, there were 23 murders. And the crime rate went down dramatically, as you pointed out earlier. And the way we did that was by bringing the public into the process. In other words, it's no longer just, we have no business reserving our protection only to the people who get paid to do it, because protection is everybody's job. There was a time when everybody in the community was responsible for protection. Some people rode out in posses and some people stayed home and comforted the victims, but everybody was involved. And so that's what we did in Austin. We just got everybody involved. Neighbors, we had what we call neighborhood conference committees, where citizens in a safe environment would sentence young people as a result of crimes that they had committed in that neighborhood. And everybody's rights were very carefully protected. The young person had to ask to be part of that process and could get out of it whenever he or she wanted to. The most common question you hear outside a criminal courtroom, when a defendant comes outside, he and a lawyer have been in there and they've pled guilty before the judge, most commonly. Judge has sentenced the defendant and they both walk outside, and then the defendant turns to his lawyer and says, "What happened in there?" In other words, there's no accountability. What was that all about?
What about laws, though? What about laws? And I'll give you just 4. You pick which one you think would work. A moratorium on the death penalty. An innocence commission such as they have in North Carolina that released a guy today who'd served there 14 years simply because of unreliable testimony, not DNA. Sentencing guidelines. Finally, a statewide public defender. Take your choice.
The first one was an innocence commission, did you say? Mm-hmm. I'm all for that. I think we should have nothing to fear from an innocence commission. In fact, I did that myself. I set up my own DNA commission as district attorney. Whenever we had 4 cases, I believe, where DNA testing showed the innocence of the person who had been convicted. And that absolutely horrified everybody in my office. It's hard enough to convict the guilty. We don't need to be convicting the innocent. Too many people in prison now. And so we undertook an in-depth study of all of our convictions where there was evidence available for DNA testing. And the result of that was that we found nobody else had been improperly convicted that we could show was improperly convicted. that drew national attention. We were the first prosecutor's office in the country to do that. But we basically graded our own paper. And other than the 4 cases, 2 of them coming out of one incident, other than those cases, we didn't have anybody else that we could show was demonstrably innocent.
All right, well, I want to talk about transportation. There's been a lot of controversy about Governor Perry's transportation program, the Trans-Texas Corridor, tollways, foreign-owned, with the Texas partner, whatever. That's allegedly all gone now, but we have a growing state with growing transportation needs that we're not funding. Any ideas on how we take care of our growing transportation needs?
Well, it's going to require additional sources of money, of course. And nobody knows where they're coming from, which is, again, why I would favor an in-depth study of the system that we have now. That's really not been done in a long time in the way that it ought to be done, so that we see what the long-term implications of this tax structure are. Since it falls most heavily on the middle class, that really shoots ourselves in the foot, because we don't have any way of long-term funding, meeting long-term funding needs. But in terms of highways, I think mass transit's one option. It's very difficult to break the Texas tradition of one person, one horse, that is translated now into one person, one car. And it's hard to get us off our horse and out of our cars. That's hard to do, and it's going to take...
So you'd raise the gas tax in order to fund for new highways? New construction programs, bridges repaired, things like that?
That's one option. And I said nothing would be off the table, but there are lots of sources of tax money, and only a few have been adequately explored. And those are, if you look at the tax structure that we have in Texas, you will see that that and those who are being taxed are those with the least effective lobby in Austin. And that is no way to run a railroad.
Now, one of the things that goes on with our transportation funding now, the gas tax that goes to the state, is taken off and not spent on transportation projects. For example, Department of Public Safety is funded by the transportation taxes, and there's other state entities that are funded that have nothing to do with transportation whatsoever. Do you think it's time to cut off the siphoning off of the transportation funds and leave the funds, at least that they're getting, with TxDOT and the legislature determining where those are spent?
That would be up to the will of the legislature. I have my own thoughts about that, but my job as Lieutenant Governor will not be to dictate what I think ought to be the tax structure of the state. It'll be my job to be fair about how we come up with answers to these questions and solutions to these problems. And it is in that capacity that I think that the most effective way to approach this series of what appear to be insoluble problems is to turn it over to the public and get the lobby out of the way.
In fact, that's not any different than, I guess, than the problems with higher education. We have some people describe as runaway tuition increases at our public universities, but at the same time, the legislature has essentially defunded higher education over time. The percent of the higher education budgets have gone from over 50% to under 20% now, David. So we're not really spending a lot state resources, and so it looks like the legislature kind of made a deal, said, we won't give you more money, we'll just let you raise tuition, then we can criticize you publicly for it, but then we'll leave you alone. So it's, I guess,
there's a question there.
Somewhere there's a question. I guess, isn't that in fact just another way of raising taxes,
Well,
this time on the middle class again?
Well, of course it is. And not only that, it's a way of shooting ourselves in the foot. I mean, it's absurd. What we're doing is doing away with the capacity of the middle class to send their children to college. That's how I got to college. I mean, my family was not rich. I had to work my way partially through college, but they helped me. And I could not have gone to college had the tuition been any higher. I mean, the idea that what that does is it cuts down the size of the employment pool and makes Texas less attractive to industries and business coming in from out of state. It's with a less educated workforce, especially a workforce that has had less exposure to higher education. You really can't expect the tax base to expand. So it has consequences downstream. It's like when I was a kid, I was raised on a small ranch, and a creek ran through it. Not a river, but a creek. A creek ran through it, and we had some cattle, not very many cattle. But I learned pretty early that if you wanted to water in the stream to be in the creek, to be clear, you kept the cattle out of it upstream. And it's not rocket science. And what we're doing is polluting the water literally for our children and grandchildren, both in terms of the function that government is supposed to perform and who pays for it. And what it does.
Well, on that thought, David, I think...
He's obviously not all hat and no cattle.
No, he's very good. Well, thank you so much, Ronnie Earle, for being our guest. You can view tonight's show along with a follow-up discussion of tonight's show, plus find out more about Red, White, and Blue by visiting us at HoustonPBS.org. In fact, you can watch the show multiple times if you want, so check it out. Until next time, get informed and get active, and please vote in the March primary.